The Galactic Concord Assembly was the largest structure ever built by living hands. A station that floated in the empty black between three star systems, like a city carved from metal and light. Home to diplomats and traders and spies from over 400 known species. All of them talking, always talking, because in the galaxy, the ones who talked the loudest were the ones who survived. Or so they believed. Scribe Olurethi moved through the lower corridors of the station with the slow, drifting grace of his kind. A creature that resembled a translucent jellyfish, his body glowing faintly blue as he carried a stack of data tablets pressed against his membrane with 3 delicate tendrils. He was an archivist, one of the last of a dying profession, and his job was to record everything that happened in the assembly halls so that future generations could learn from it. He had been doing this work for 22 cycles, and in all that time, he had never once found humans interesting. They sat in the mid-tier section of the assembly chamber, not at the front with the elder species who had ruled the stars for millennia, and not at the back with the newly uplisted civilizations still learning how to use faster-than-light drives. The humans occupied a quiet row near the middle, and they always sent the same representative, an elderly woman named Ambassador Ren Solara, who had silver hair and dark skin and a smile that never seemed to leave her face. She smiled when she spoke, and she smiled when she listened, and she smiled when other species insulted her world. And Olurethi had always found that deeply confusing. In his experience, species that smiled during insults were either plotting revenge or too stupid to understand what was happening, and he had long ago decided that the humans were simply the latter. After all, what kind of Deathworld species behaved like this? Every youngling in the galaxy learned about Deathworlds in their first year of education. Planets where gravity crushed bones, where the atmosphere burned lungs, where the weather alone could kill in 100 different ways. Earth had been classified as a Category 12 Deathworld, the highest rating the Concord had ever given, a world of earthquakes and hurricanes and volcanic eruptions, and predators with too many teeth, and oceans that could swallow entire civilizations. The species that crawled out of such a hell should have been monsters, should have been conquerors who burned their way across the stars with fire and fury. But the humans just sat there, smiling, voting on trade agreements, and sending polite letters when bad things happened. It made no sense to Olurethi, and so he had stopped trying to make sense of it. He filed them under anomaly in his archive, and moved on to more interesting subjects, like the Velkari Dominion. Now the Velkari were what a Deathworld species was supposed to look like. They stood 7 feet tall on average, with bodies covered in dark armored carapace that could stop a plasma bolt. 4 powerful arms that ended in claws sharp enough to tear through hull plating, and compound eyes that glowed a deep and unsettling red. They came from a high-gravity world, with acid rain and predators the size of buildings, and they had conquered their way to the stars exactly the way everyone expected a Deathworld species would, with violence, with hunger, with an empire built on the broken backs of weaker civilizations. Their leader was Warlord Tyvan Krall, Supreme Commander of the Dominion, and he was the largest Velkari Olurethi had ever seen, nearly 8 feet of chitin and muscle and arrogance, with a voice that rumbled through the assembly chamber like distant thunder. Krall loved the assembly, not because he cared about diplomacy, but because he loved an audience. 3 systems, he announced one morning, standing at the central podium while 400 species watched from their tiered seats. 3 systems have joined the Dominion this cycle, and their people now enjoy the protection and purpose that only strength can provide. Everyone knew what joined meant. Velkari had arrived with warships, and the smaller species had been given a simple choice: submit or burn. 3 more civilizations had chosen to submit, and the Concord had done nothing about it, because the Concord never did anything about it. Ambassador Solara raised her hand and was granted speaking time. The human delegation notes its concern regarding the forced annexation of sovereign worlds, she said in that calm, measured voice she always used. And we urge the Velkhari Dominion to pursue diplomatic solutions in future territorial disputes. Kral turned all four of his arms outward in the Velkhari gesture of amusement, and his mandibles clicked rapidly. He was laughing. Concern, he repeated, savoring the word as if it tasted sweet. The Deathworlders note their concern. Tell me, Ambassador, does your species do anything besides note concern? In 40 years among us, your kind has never raised a claw, never shown a fang, never once acted like the monsters your world should have made you. A ripple of quiet amusement moved through the chamber. Many species had thought the same thing, but never dared say it aloud. Solara simply smiled and returned to her seat. Olurethi recorded the exchange in his archive and added a small personal note. Humans continue to present no threat and no interest. But that night, alone in the archive, something strange happened. He was cataloging old transmissions, radio signals and data bursts that species had broadcast before they discovered faster-than-light communication, the kind of signals that leaked into space and traveled for centuries before anyone picked them up. Every species had them, embarrassing remnants of their primitive years, and Olurethi usually found them charming in a sad sort of way. The human transmissions were different. He found recordings of something called the Second World War, a conflict on Earth that had killed over 70 million humans in just 6 years. He found images of mushroom clouds rising over 2 cities, weapons that the humans had built and then used on themselves, weapons that could crack the skin of a planet. He found records of something called the Cold War, where 2 human nations had aimed thousands of these weapons at each other for decades, each side ready to destroy the entire world rather than lose. He found a doctrine they had named mutually assured destruction, and when he translated the concept into his own language, his body flickered with involuntary bioluminescence, the equivalent of a shiver running down a spine he did not have. These were not the records of a weak species. These were the records of a species that had nearly destroyed itself, not once, but many times, and had somehow chosen to stop, a species that knew exactly what it was capable of, and had decided, deliberately, to be quiet. Olurethi stared at his data tablet for a long time, his tendrils trembling, and for the first time in 22 cycles, he wondered if the galaxy had made a terrible mistake. The next morning, Warlord Kral stood before the assembly once again, and this time, his voice carried a new kind of hunger. The hunger of a predator that had tasted easy prey too many times, and now wanted something bigger. The Velkhari Dominion announces its intention to extend protection to the system of Ketha Prime, he declared, his red eyes sweeping across the chamber. The Kethani people will benefit greatly from our guidance, and we expect the transition to be swift and painless. Silence fell across the assembly, because everyone knew what Ketha Prime was, a small agrarian world populated by gentle herbivores who had never harmed anyone, a world that sat under the Mutual Defense Pact of the Human Colonial Alliance. Kral was not just annexing another weak species, he was daring the humans to do something about it. Every eye in the chamber turned to the human delegation. Ambassador Solara sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. She did not raise her hand for speaking time. She did not issue a statement of concern, and she did not smile. For the first time in 40 years, the human ambassador was not smiling. And deep in the archive, Scribe Olurethi felt his glow dim with a fear he could not name, because he alone in that chamber understood what that silence might actually mean. Not weakness, not acceptance, not surrender, but the quiet before something terrible. Captain Elera Voss stood on the observation deck of the transit shuttle and watched the stars streak past the viewport as the ship carried her away from the Concord assembly, and toward a destination she had hoped she would never have to visit. The deep bunker beneath the mountains of Earth, where the real decisions were made, the ones the galaxy never saw. She was a tall woman with short dark hair and a scar that ran from her left ear to her jawline, a souvenir from a mining colony riot 6 years ago, when she had still been a Marine, back before the diplomatic corps had recruited her and asked her to trade her rifle for a smile and a handshake. She had been good at both jobs, but she had always known which one would call her back first. The shuttle dropped out of faster-than-light travel in Earth's system, and Voss pressed her face closer to the viewport. She had not been home in 3 years, and the sight of that blue and white marble hanging in the darkness still hit her somewhere deep in her chest every single time. That was the Death World, the Category 12 nightmare that the galaxy feared and pitied in equal measure. And it was also the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. 30 minutes later, she was underground, walking through corridors carved into granite that was older than most galactic civilizations. And she was not alone. Officers in dark uniforms moved with purpose through the halls of the United Colonial Command, and their faces carried an expression she recognized from her years in the Marines. The expression of people who had been preparing for something for a very long time, and had just been told that the something was finally here. The War Council chamber was a circular room with a domed ceiling and a holographic display table at its center that currently showed a 3-dimensional map of the Ketha system, with 200 red markers representing the Valkyrie forward fleet, and 1 small green dot representing Ketha Prime. Ambassador Solara was already there. The warm smile was gone. The gentle voice was gone. And in their place was something cold and sharp and furious. This was not the diplomat the galaxy knew, but the woman behind the mask. And she was speaking to a man Voss had only ever seen in classified briefings. Fleet Admiral Marcus Cole was in his 60s, with gray hair cut close to his skull and eyes that looked like they had been carved from stone. He was the commander of Earth's combined fleet, and outside of this bunker, almost nobody in the galaxy knew his name, which was exactly how he wanted it. "They have 200 warships in the Ketha system," Solara was saying, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "And they have issued a surrender ultimatum. 3 cycles, Marcus. 3 cycles before they start bombing farmers." "I am aware," Cole replied, and his voice was quiet in the way the deep water was quiet, still on the surface, with enormous weight underneath. Voss took her seat at the table beside Dr. Asha Okonkwo, the Director of Strategic Intelligence, a woman with silver-streaked braids and glasses she did not need, but wore anyway, because she said they made her look harmless. Dr. Okonkwo had spent 20 years building humanity's reputation as a species that was loud about concern and quiet about everything else, and she had done it on purpose. "The question before this council," Okonkwo said, pulling up a series of classified files on the display, "is whether this is the moment we have been preparing for since first contact." She tapped the display, and the map changed. The 200 red Valkyrie markers remained, but now the map showed something else. 8 clusters of blue markers hidden in locations spread across human-controlled space, tucked behind gas giants, and inside hollowed-out asteroids, and drifting in the dark spaces between stars where no one ever looked. Each blue cluster represented a full battle fleet. Each fleet contained between 300 and 500 warships. The galaxy knew about 30 human patrol ships, small, lightly armed vessels that escorted cargo transports and responded to distress calls. That was the face humanity showed to the universe, the face Okonkwo had carefully designed, and behind that face was something the galaxy had never imagined. Over 3,000 warships, built in secret over 4 decades, crewed by men and women who had trained in silence for a war they hoped would never come. The doctrine has always been clear, Okonkwo continued. We get one reveal. The moment we show the galaxy what we actually have, every calculation changes forever. Every species reclassifies us. Every alliance shifts. Every enemy either backs down or escalates. We cannot unring this bell, so the question is simple. Is Ketha Prime worth ringing it? Silence held the room for a long moment. Then Ambassador Solara spoke, and her voice was no longer furious. It was something worse, something colder. There are 9 million Kethani on that world, she said. They are farmers. They grow a grain called Tellus that feeds 20 systems. They have no army, no weapons, no warships. They signed a mutual defense pact with us because we told them, we looked them in their gentle faces and told them that they would be safe, that humanity would protect them. She paused and looked around the table. If we let them burn to protect our secret, then we deserve every insult the galaxy has ever thrown at us. We deserve to be called toothless. We deserve to be called weak. Because a species that lets innocents die when it has the power to save them is not patient. It is cowardly. Fleet Admiral Cole nodded once, slowly, and then he reached for the console in front of him and entered a code that Voss knew had never been used before. Protocol Leviathan is active, he said simply. All fleets to deployment stations. We move in 48 hours. Voss felt her heart hammering as the reality sank in. 40 years of hiding. 40 years of smiling through insults and absorbing mockery. 40 years of watching the Velkari devour civilization after civilization while humanity sat quietly and waited. All of it was about to end. She was assigned her role within the hour. She would go to Ketha Prime ahead of the fleet, officially to organize the civilian evacuation, unofficially to place ground beacons that the fleet would use to coordinate their arrival. When she landed on Ketha Prime 2 days later, she found a world of rolling golden fields and gentle creatures who stood about 4 feet tall, with soft fur and wide dark eyes, full of a fear they did not know how to express. The Kethani had never known war, had never even conceived of the idea that someone might want to hurt them, and now there were Velkari warships visible in their night sky like angry red stars. The Kethani elder who met her at the landing site was trembling, but when Voss explained the evacuation plan, the elder shook her head. "This is our home," the elder said, in a voice like wind through tall grass. "Our ancestors grew the first Tellus here 10,000 years ago. We cannot leave." Voss knelt so she was at eye level with the elder, and she spoke in the simplest, most honest words she had. "You will not lose your home," she said. "I give you my word." Meanwhile, humanity sent a single diplomatic shuttle to the Velkari fleet, Ambassador Solara, alone, requesting a meeting with Warlord Krall. The Warlord was so amused by this that he ordered the meeting broadcast live across every galactic communication channel, so that the entire galaxy could watch the humans embarrass themselves one final time. Solara sat across from Krall in his flagship's war chamber. He towered over her, all 8 feet of armored chitin and clicking mandibles and glowing red eyes. And he gave a long, grand speech about the natural order of the galaxy, about predators and prey, about strength and weakness, about how the Velkari were destined to rule because they were the sharpest blade the universe had ever forged. When he finished, Solara looked up at him and the galaxy watched. "Warlord Krall," she said, and her voice was perfectly calm, "I am not here to negotiate. I am here to deliver a courtesy, something your species has never extended to others. I am here to warn you." She stood and smoothed her jacket, this small elderly woman in a room full of monsters. "You have 72 hours to withdraw every ship from this system," she said. "This is not a request." Krall stared at her for a moment. and then he laughed. A deep, rumbling sound that echoed through the chamber and across 1 billion screens across the galaxy. "Or what?" he asked, spreading all 4 arms wide. Solara turned and walked toward the door, without answering. "Or what?" Krall called after her, laughing harder now, and every Velkari officer on the bridge joined in, and across the galaxy 100 species watched and shook their heads at the foolish, toothless humans. But somewhere in the deep dark spaces between the stars, 8 fleets were already moving, and 72 hours had begun to count down. The first 60 hours passed and nothing happened, which was exactly what the Velkari expected. Their 200 warships held position around Ketha Prime, in a wide aggressive formation, weapons hot, shields at full power, and Warlord Krall spent the time hosting a parade of allied observers on his flagship. Representatives from client species and rival powers, who had come to watch the great humiliation of the so-called Deathworlders. "They will send another shuttle," Krall told his audience, with a click of amusement in his mandibles. "Perhaps this time the old woman will bring a strongly worded letter. Perhaps she will note her concern at us very loudly." His officers laughed, and the observers laughed with them, because it was safer to laugh with a Velkari than to do anything else. On Ketha Prime below, Captain Alara Voss worked through the nights without sleep. She moved through the golden fields and quiet villages, planting ground beacons disguised as agricultural sensors, each one a pinpoint of light that would guide what was coming. And when the Cathani farmers asked her what the devices were for, she simply told them not to worry. She did not tell them about the fleet. She did not tell them that she had received a single encrypted message from Fleet Admiral Cole 12 hours ago. Just 3 words: "We are coming." At hour 65, the first strange readings appeared on the Velkari sensor arrays. The long-range detection grid that surrounded their fleet began registering contacts at the very edge of its range. Faint signatures that appeared for a fraction of a second and then vanished, like shadows moving at the corner of your eye. The sensor officer on Krall's flagship flagged the readings, and a technical team was sent to investigate. They concluded that the anomalies were gravitational echoes from a nearby pulsar bouncing off the system's asteroid belt. Nothing more than ghosts in the machine. They were wrong. At hour 70, with just 2 hours remaining on the human ultimatum, Krall ordered his fleet to begin pre-bombardment targeting. Weapons officers locked firing solutions onto Ketha Prime's largest population centers, and the targeting data was broadcast openly, so that the Cathani could see it on their own primitive scanners. This was standard Velkari practice, a final act of psychological warfare designed to break a species' will before the first shot was ever fired. The Cathani panicked. Families gathered in the streets. Children cried. Elders prayed to gods who had never needed to answer prayers about war before. Voss stood in the central square of the largest settlement and watched the sky and said nothing. But her hand rested on the communicator on her belt, and her jaw was tight. At hour 71, the sensor ghosts returned, but this time there were more of them. Hundreds of contacts flickered in and out at the edge of detection, and they were closer now, and they were not bouncing off the asteroid belt. The sensor officer sent a second report to the bridge, and this time his voice carried a note of uncertainty that made Krall's second-in-command pause. "Increase scanning range to maximum," the second-in-command ordered, "and deploy probe drones to the outer system boundary." The probes launched and raced outward into the dark, and then, one by one, they stopped transmitting. Not destroyed, not jammed, just silent, as if something had swallowed them whole. At hour 71 and 45 minutes, the Velkari communications officer detected a new signal, a single broadband transmission on every frequency simultaneously, cutting through every channel like a blade through silk. It was a countdown. It was in every known galactic language. It was at 15 minutes and falling. Kral pushed through his officers to the command console and stared at the signal with his red compound eyes narrowing. "What is this?" he demanded. No one answered, because no one knew. At 5 minutes, the sensor array finally showed what was coming, and every officer on the bridge went still. Contacts, not hundreds, but thousands, materializing out of the black in a perfect sphere that surrounded the entire Valkyrie fleet. They were dropping out of faster-than-light travel in coordinated waves, each wave precisely timed to close another gap in the formation. And they were close, terrifyingly close, as if they had known exactly where every Valkyrie ship was positioned and had planned their arrival down to the meter. At the 60-second mark, the countdown stopped, and 3,000 human warships became visible on every scanner in the system. They were unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Matte black vessels with angular hulls and no ornamentation, no decorative markings, no wasted curves. Every line was functional, every surface was armored, and they bristled with weapons arrays that the Valkyrie tactical computers could not even classify. Dreadnoughts the size of small moons sat at the center of the formation, surrounded by carriers launching swarms of fighter craft, flanked by cruisers whose missile pods were already open and aimed. And weaving between them all were hundreds of sleek destroyers that appeared and disappeared from sensors like predators circling wounded prey. The Valkyrie fleet of 200 ships sat in the center of this sphere like a single fish surrounded by sharks. On every screen across the galaxy, in the assembly, in homes, in government chambers on 1,000 worlds, the image was the same. The supposedly toothless humans had just revealed the largest military force any living species had ever witnessed. Then a voice came through on all frequencies, calm, measured, and absolutely devoid of mercy. "This is Fleet Admiral Marcus Cole of the United Colonial Command," the voice said. "Valkyrie Dominion forces, you are surrounded. Your fleet is outgunned by a factor of 15 to 1. You will power down weapons, lower shields, and withdraw from this system immediately. Any ship that fires will be destroyed. Any ship that targets the planet will be destroyed. There will be no second warning. There will be no negotiation. There will be no mercy." A pause. "You were warned." On the Concord Assembly Station, Scribe Olarethi stood in the archive, watching the live feed with his entire body flickering in bioluminescent shock. Around him, other archivists had stopped working and were staring at their screens with the silent terror of creatures who had just realized they had been sleeping next to a predator their entire lives. In the assembly chamber above, 400 species ambassadors erupted into chaos. Intelligence officers from every major power were screaming into communicators, demanding to know how this was possible. Where had the ships come from? Where had they been hidden? How had humanity built this armada without anyone knowing? On his bridge, Warlord Kral stared at the tactical display, and for the first time in his long and violent life, he felt something he had only ever inflicted on others. Fear. It was a cold, crawling thing that moved through his carapace like ice water, and he hated it more than he had ever hated anything. More than his enemies, more than weakness, more than the smiling human ambassador who had stood in this very room and warned him, actually warned him, and he had laughed. He had laughed. Around him his officers waited for orders, and he could see the fear in them too. Could see it in the way their claws gripped their consoles, in the way their compound eyes darted between the tactical display and his face, waiting to see if their warlord had an answer to the impossible thing that had just happened. Kral's pride made the decision his survival instincts screamed against. "All ships, forward attack formation," he commanded, his voice steady, even as something inside him cracked. "We break through the encirclement and regroup in open space. The Valkyrie do not run. His fleet surged forward, 200 warships charging toward the nearest section of the human sphere, with weapons blazing and shields at maximum. The battle lasted 11 minutes. The humans fought the way their ships looked, without decoration, without wasted motion, without emotion. Their communications were clipped tactical callouts, target designations, and confirmation codes. No war cries, no speeches, no anger. They fought like a machine, every ship knowing exactly where to be and exactly when to fire. And the precision of it was the most terrifying thing Olurethi had ever witnessed. Valkyrie warships exploded or went dark one after another, as the human fleet tightened its sphere like a fist closing. The dreadnoughts laid down walls of firepower that no Valkyrie shield could withstand. The cruisers launched missile salvos that tracked their targets with impossible accuracy. And the destroyers, those ghostly black predators, slipped behind the Valkyrie formation and cut off every escape route. Some human ships targeted engines and weapon systems with surgical strikes, disabling ships without killing their crews. Others, the ones facing vessels that had been aimed at the planet, showed no such restraint. In 11 minutes, 200 Valkyrie warships were reduced to 40 crippled hulks, drifting in the dark, their weapons dead, their shields gone, their hulls torn open to the void. Krall's flagship was the last to fall. It took 3 dreadnoughts focusing their fire simultaneously to bring down its shields, and even then, the great ship fought on for another 90 seconds before a final volley tore through its engine core and left it burning and powerless. Krall stood on his ruined bridge, surrounded by sparking consoles and the groans of wounded officers, and watched through a cracked viewport as the black human dreadnoughts glided silently past his shattered fleet, vast, dark, and silent, like the predators the galaxy had always feared but never actually met. On Ketha Prime below, the Cathani farmers looked up at the sky and saw the flashes of the battle fade. They did not understand what had happened, but Captain Voss understood. She stood in the golden field, with her hands still on her communicator, and her eyes wet, not from sadness, but from the sheer overwhelming relief of a promise kept. The elder approached her with trembling steps. "Is it over?" she asked. Voss knelt and put her hand on the elder's shoulder. "This part is over," she said quietly. "But what comes next will be harder." The galaxy does not forget quickly, and it does not forgive easily. And in the days after the Battle of Ketha, both of these truths became clear in the worst possible way. The footage spread across every communication network within hours. 3,000 human warships appearing from nowhere, the 11-minute destruction of a Valkyrie fleet, and Fleet Admiral Cole's cold, precise ultimatum that had offered no mercy and delivered exactly what it promised. Species that had coexisted with humanity for 40 years watched the recordings over and over again, and each time they watched, they recalculated everything they thought they knew. Fear moved through the galaxy like a disease. On the Concord Assembly Station, the human delegation section was suddenly empty. Ambassadors who had once stopped to chat with Solara's staff now crossed to the other side of the corridor when they saw a human approaching. The Tillerai ambassador, who had shared lunch with a human trade attaché every week for 6 years, canceled all future meetings without explanation. "If they hid this," the Tillerai ambassador whispered to a colleague, "what else are they hiding?" It was the question everyone was asking, and no one had an answer, and the absence of an answer was more frightening than any weapon. But for Warlord Tyvan Krall, fear was not the dominant emotion. Rage was. He had been pulled from his shattered flagship by his own rescue teams, and brought back to the Valkyrie homeworld of Drathvel, where he stood before the Council of Warlords with his carapace still cracked and his pride in far worse condition. The council chamber was a vast underground cavern carved from volcanic rock, lit by rivers of magma that flowed through channels in the floor. And every living warlord was present. 12 of them, the most powerful military leaders of the Dominion. And they were not pleased. 200 ships, the eldest warlord said, her voice like grinding stone. Destroyed in minutes, by a species we have mocked for 4 decades. Explain this, Kral. Kral stood tall despite the pain in his broken body. I will not explain, he said. I will answer. Not with words, but with the only language that matters. He activated the ancient protocol that no Valkyrie leader had invoked in over 300 years. The Total War Proclamation, a rite older than their civilization's spacefaring age. A declaration that committed every resource, every ship, every soldier, and every colony to the complete and total destruction of a named enemy. The council erupted in argument. Some called it madness. Others called it necessary. But Kral's voice cut through them all. They humiliated us before the galaxy, he snarled. Every species that serves us, every species that fears us, every species that has ever bowed to the Dominion, they all watched us burn. If we do not answer this, the Dominion dies anyway, not from human weapons, but from the loss of the only thing that has ever held our empire together, the belief that we cannot be beaten. The vote was not unanimous, but it passed. And within hours, the proclamation was broadcast on every Valkyrie frequency. Total war against the human species. No terms, no negotiations, no end until one side was destroyed. 20,000 warships began to mobilize across Dominion space. Not just the Valkyrie fleet, but every warship from every client species they controlled. All of them pressed into service, the largest armada ever assembled in the recorded history of the galaxy. On Earth, the news arrived in the War Council chamber beneath the mountains, and Fleet Admiral Cole read the proclamation in silence while his officers waited. 20,000, Captain Voss said from her seat, having returned from Ketha Prime just 2 days before. That is almost 7 times our fleet strength. Numbers are not everything, Dr. Okonkwo replied, adjusting her unnecessary glasses. The Valkyrie client species do not want to fight this war. They were forced into service, and forced soldiers fight poorly. The core Valkyrie fleet is perhaps 8,000 ships, and we have already proven that our technology is superior. Superior technology did not save Nova Anchorage, Ambassador Solara said quietly, and the room went cold. The report had come in that morning. A Valkyrie strike force of 300 ships had bypassed human patrol routes and hit Nova Anchorage, a civilian space station orbiting a colony world in the outer territories. It was a logistics hub, a trading post, a place where families lived and children went to school, and the Valkyrie had hit it with everything they had. 14,000 people were dead, men, women, and children burned to nothing in the time it took for a distress signal to reach the nearest fleet. The Valkyrie had broadcast footage of the attack across the galaxy as propaganda, and Kral's voice accompanied the images. This is what happens to species that challenge the Dominion. We do not defeat our enemies. We erase them. Voss watched the footage once, in a small room by herself, and when she emerged, her face was a mask that her fellow officers recognized from their years in the service. Not grief, not rage, but the cold, settled expression of a human being who had moved past both of those things into something quieter and far more dangerous. Humanity shifted to full war footing in a way the galaxy had never seen a species mobilize. Every colony activated defense grids that had been built into their infrastructure decades ago. Systems that most colonists had assumed were power regulators or communication arrays, but were actually weapons platforms, shield generators, and sensor networks. Civilian cargo ships reported to military staging areas where retrofit teams worked around the clock to bolt armor plating and weapons mounts onto hulls designed for hauling grain and machine parts. Every military reserve was activated, and the volunteers poured in so fast that recruitment centers had to turn people away. And then Dr. Okonkwo revealed the final layer, the one even most of the War Council had not known about. Project Fenrir, she said, activating a classified display that showed Earth's solar system and a network of installations hidden throughout the Oort cloud, the vast shell of ice and rock that surrounded humanity's home star at the very edge of its gravitational reach. Autonomous weapons platforms, AI-guided minefields, and a directed energy array capable of disabling an entire fleet at range, Okonkwo explained, built over 30 years in absolute secrecy as a last resort defense of Earth itself. If the Velkari reach our home system, they will find that the Deathworld has teeth they cannot imagine. Cole nodded slowly. Let us make sure it does not come to that, he said. We take the war to them. Captain Voss was reassigned from diplomatic liaison to her true calling, Combat Command. She took charge of the 1st Deathworld Marine Division, an elite ground force composed entirely of volunteers who specialized in fighting on worlds that would kill any other species. The soldiers who operated in crushing gravity and toxic atmospheres and temperatures that could melt metal. The ones who trained on Earth's worst environments, because nothing the galaxy could throw at them was worse than home. They were the humans the galaxy had nightmares about, and they had been waiting for this their entire careers. The war's first major engagement came 3 weeks later, when a Velkari armada of 5,000 ships struck at the human colony of Brennan's World, a mining planet with heavy gravity and sulfuric storms. The human fleet met them at the system's edge, and the battle raged for 9 hours in a maelstrom of plasma fire and missile salvos that lit up the void like a dying star. Humanity won, but it was not the clean surgical victory of Ketha. 67 human ships were lost, over 4,000 sailors killed, and the Velkari retreated in relatively good order, their fleet damaged but not destroyed. This would not be an easy war. This would not be a short war, and across the galaxy, every species watched and understood that whatever happened next would reshape the balance of power for centuries to come. In the archive on the Concord station, Scribe Olarethi recorded the declaration of total war and the attack on Nova Anchorage, and for the first time in his career, he added a personal entry to the official record. The galaxy mocked the humans for their silence, he wrote. We called them weak, we called them toothless, we laughed when they smiled, and assumed their patience was cowardice. We were fools, all of us, because we forgot the oldest truth the universe has ever taught. The most dangerous predator is not the one that roars from the mountaintop. It is the one that watches from the tall grass in absolute silence, waiting, 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 until the moment it decides to move. And now, it had moved, and nothing would ever be the same. The war lasted 8 months, and in that time, the galaxy learned something about humanity that no species had ever understood before. Not just that humans could fight, because the Battle of Ketha had proven that beyond any doubt, but that humans could fight with a kind of terrible, methodical patience that was far more frightening than rage. They did not burn the Velkari Empire to ash, though they had the power to do it. They dismantled it, piece by piece, the way a surgeon removes a tumor, cutting away the dangerous parts while fighting to save what could still be saved. Fleet Admiral Cole ran the war from his command ship, the UCS Everest, a dreadnought so large that smaller ships docked inside it, and his strategy was built on 3 principles that he repeated to every officer under his command. Strike military targets only, minimize civilian casualties always, and offer surrender before every engagement, always, without exception, even when they knew the enemy was desperate. Offer would be refused. We are not them, he told his fleet commanders. The moment we become what we are fighting, we have already lost, no matter how many battles we win. The Velkari did not understand this, could not understand this, and it terrified them more than the weapons. They came from a culture where war meant total annihilation, where the strong devoured the weak completely. And a species that had the power to destroy them, but chose restraint, was something that did not fit into any framework they possessed. Captain Voss and her first Deathworld Marines became the tip of humanity's spear on the ground, and their reputation grew with every engagement, until the Velkhari soldiers spoke of them in the same hushed tones their ancestors had once reserved for ancient demons. The assault on the fortress world of Drathkel was the battle that cemented the legend. Drathkel was a Velkhari military stronghold, a high-gravity planet with acid rain, surface temperatures that averaged 140 degrees, and an atmosphere that was toxic to every known species in the galaxy except the Velkhari themselves. It was considered impregnable, the one world in the Dominion that could never be taken by force, and Krall had stationed 50,000 of his best troops there, along with planetary defense weapons that could tear warships apart in orbit. Cole's fleet cleared the orbital defenses in 6 hours of intense fighting, losing 12 ships in the process. And then it was the Marines' turn. Voss led 3,000 soldiers in drop pods through the acid rain, falling through clouds that dissolved the outer layer of their armor before they even hit the ground. They landed in the middle of a volcanic plain, where the heat shimmered off black rock, and every breath of the filtered air tasted like burning metal. The Velkhari defenders expected the humans to die within hours. No soft-skinned species could survive on Drathkel, and the fortress had been designed with this certainty as its foundation. The Marines took the fortress in 3 days. They fought through conditions that should have been lethal, advancing through acid storms and 140-degree heat, as if they were walking through an unpleasant but manageable afternoon. Their armor was designed for exactly this kind of environment, built by a species that had evolved on a world where the weather itself was a weapon, and what the Velkhari considered impregnable, the humans considered merely difficult. Voss personally led the breach of the inner command center, cutting through a reinforced blast door with a plasma torch, while acid rain hissed against her back. And when she entered the chamber, she found the Velkhari general standing behind his command table with a look of bewilderment that was almost comical. "How are you still standing?" the general asked, his mandibles slack with disbelief. Voss looked at him through her scarred visor, bleeding from a shrapnel wound in her shoulder that she had not bothered to treat because there were still objectives to secure. "This is a nice day where I come from," she said. The general surrendered, and his 50,000 troops followed, and Drathkel, the impregnable fortress, fell too. The Deathworlders, who did not have the courtesy to die when they were supposed to. The war ground on, through 6 months, then 7, and with each passing week, the Velkhari dominion grew smaller. Human fleets liberated the client species one by one, offering each conquered civilization a choice. Join humanity's alliance or go free, no obligations, no tribute, no submission. Most chose freedom, and the humans let them go without complaint, which baffled the galaxy almost as much as the military victories. By the 8th month, the Dominion had shrunk to its core systems, and Warlord Krall had gathered every remaining warship for a final stand in the Velkhari home system. 8,000 ships, everything that was left, crewed by soldiers who knew they were fighting not just for victory, but for the survival of their civilization. The human combined fleet arrived in the home system on a morning that had no morning, just the cold light of the Velkhari star and the silent formation of 2,500 human warships that had survived 8 months of the bloodiest war the galaxy had ever seen. Admiral Cole broadcast one final offer of surrender, as he had done before every single engagement of the war. "Velkhari forces," his voice said across all channels, "you have fought with courage that any species would respect. This war does not need to end with more death. Stand down your weapons, and we will negotiate an honorable peace. This is my final offer, and I make it sincerely." On his bridge, Krall listened to the human admiral's words and felt something complicated move through him. Not just rage, not just pride, but something that might have been the very edge of respect, though he would have torn off his own arm before admitting it. "No," he said, and his fleet surged forward. The final battle was the largest single engagement in galactic history. 8,000 Valkyrie warships against 2,500 human vessels in a clash that lit up the home system like a second sun. It raged for 14 hours, and it was devastating on both sides. The humans lost over 100 ships and thousands of sailors, and the Valkyrie lost far more, their fleet breaking apart under the weight of superior technology and that same terrifying coordination that had doomed them at Ketha. When it was over, the Valkyrie fleet was shattered. Burning hulks drifted through the system, and Krall's flagship, the last fighting ship in the Dominion Navy, was dead in space with its weapons destroyed and its engines cold. Voss led the boarding team personally. They cut through the airlock and moved through the dark corridors of the flagship in combat formation, clearing room by room, but they found no resistance. The ship was finished, its crew either dead or too wounded to fight, and the only sound was the groaning of a hull that was slowly losing structural integrity. They found Krall on his bridge. He was standing. Of course he was standing. He was Valkyrie, and the Valkyrie did not kneel. Surrounded by the bodies of his personal guard, who had fought and died to protect him even in the final moments. He was wounded, his carapace cracked in 3 places, dark fluid seeping from wounds he had not bothered to treat because there was no point anymore. And his red eyes burned with something that was not quite hatred, and not quite defeat. Voss entered the bridge with her weapon raised, and then she holstered it. The two of them stood there for a long moment, the human marine with blood on her armor, and the alien warlord with his empire in ruins around him. And then Krall spoke. "Why?" he asked, and his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. "You could have shown this power decades ago. You could have ruled the galaxy. Why did you hide?" Voss looked at him, and she did not smile. This was not a moment for smiling, but there was something in her eyes that might have been sympathy for a creature who had never been taught that strength could be anything other than a weapon. "Because we know what we are," she said. "We have seen what happens when we stop holding back. We did not hide our strength from you, warlord." She paused. "We were protecting you from it." Krall stared at her for a long, silent moment, and then something shifted in his compound eyes. Not understanding, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of it. He was taken into custody, and the Valkyrie Dominion surrendered unconditionally. In the weeks that followed, the galaxy braced itself for what it assumed was inevitable. Humanity would claim the Dominion's territory, install a puppet government, build an empire on the bones of the one it had defeated. This was how the galaxy worked. This was how every war in recorded history had ended, and every species prepared for the new order. It did not come. Humanity demanded 3 things: full demilitarization of the Valkyrie military, reparations paid to every species the Dominion had conquered over the past century, and a formal apology to the people of Ketha Prime. That was all. No territory seized, no tribute demanded, no subjugation imposed. The humans simply asked for justice, and then they began to withdraw. Ambassador Solara returned to her seat in the Galactic Concord Assembly on a day when the chamber was fuller than it had been in years. Every species had sent representatives, and the silence when she walked in was deafening. She sat down, folded her hands, and waited for the session to begin. No one mocked her. No one laughed. No one called humanity toothless. In the archive deep below the assembly, scribe Olurethi completed his final entry on the human Valkyrie War, and he took longer writing it than he had taken on any other entry in his career, because he wanted to get the words exactly right. The humans were never weak, he wrote. They were never meek. They sat quietly among us for 40 years, not because they had nothing to say, but because they knew that once they spoke, the galaxy would never stop listening. They are not predators, they are not prey, they are something the galaxy has no classification for, something that chooses, every single day, to be gentle. I have spent my life recording the actions of species who believed that power was the right to dominate. And in all that time, I never imagined I would witness a civilization that understood power as the responsibility to protect. I was wrong about them. We were all wrong about them. And I suspect that the galaxy will spend the next 1,000 years trying to understand what the humans have always known. That true strength is not the ability to destroy. It is the ability to destroy and to choose not to. He saved the entry and closed his tablet. And for the first time in his long career, he added a personal recommendation to an official archive file. Required reading, he wrote, for every species, forever. On Ketha Prime, the last human military vessel departed orbit, leaving behind a world of golden fields and gentle people who had never been harmed, whose farms had never been touched, whose children had never known the war that had been fought to protect them. Captain Voss stood at the edge of a Tellus field as the sun set over the hills, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold that reminded her of Earth, of the wheat fields in Kansas she had seen as a child, of the home she had spent 8 months fighting to be worthy of. The Cathani elder who had refused to evacuate approached her slowly. "You kept your word," the elder said. "Yes," Voss replied. A Cathani child, small and soft and wide-eyed, broke away from her mother and ran to Voss with something clutched in her tiny hands. It was a flower, a delicate thing with blue petals that grew only in the Tellus fields, and the child held it up with the earnest seriousness that only children possess. Voss knelt, took the flower, and held it carefully in hands that had broken through fortress doors, and pulled triggers, and carried wounded soldiers through acid rain. She smiled, that quiet, warm human smile that the galaxy had once mistaken for weakness. And she held the flower like it was the most precious thing in the universe, because in that moment, after everything, it was.